60 Minutes, Rewind.
As expected, the mail is still coming in on last week's story on the National Rifle Association and its determination to stop any national law to control handguns. Tonight, the other half of the gun law story, the anti-gun lobby, those Americans who want to see a strong federal gun control law. For years, there have been many groups who've wanted to see such a law, but one of the most effective voices belongs to a lobby called the National Council to Control Handguns. And it's fair to say that on guns, the council stands against just about everything the NRA stands for. Tonight, part 2 of guns.
No, I think it's ridiculous to wait for those things. Cut them back to...
Nelson T. Shields III qualifies as a sportsman, rifleman, hunter. He's got the kind of background that would make him easily fit in at an NRA convention. Old American stock, marketing manager at DuPont, a fine home in Wilmington, Delaware. There's the handsome wife and the talented children.
Great supporter.
Nelson Shields, Pete to his friends, has always been a solid, respected citizen. Pete and Jean Shields had 4 children, David, Leslie, Pam, and Nick. Nick was a standout lacrosse player. He would have been 26, but 3 years ago in San Francisco, he was murdered by a stranger, someone with a .32 caliber pistol who shot him in the back. It was the last of the infamous zebra murders, racist murders of random whites by a small group of blacks. The murder of young Nick Shields changed Pete Shields' life.
You go through a tragedy like we did with our son murdered, and I don't know whether my reaction was normal or not, but it certainly caused me to sit down and think. All right, for 26 years I've been working in business, chasing the almighty dollar, the good life, and I just came to the conclusion that maybe it was time for me to do something more meaningful with my life. And I studied this issue, and I chose this issue in the hopes that maybe I could prevent the same fate befalling some other young man.
The issue is guns. Pete Shields quit his job at DuPont and took over an outfit called the National Council to Control Handguns. It was a struggling new lobby to fight a struggling old lobby, the NRA, the National Rifle Association. But it's like comparing David with Goliath. There's just no comparison. Shields' outfit is housed in a nondescript Washington office building with a few rooms on one floor. His total budget, about $250,000 a year. That comes in $25 or $50 donations. Total membership, about 10,000 people. Shields has 2 full-time secretaries, hard workers both, but no competition for the NRA's small army of clerks and administrators and computers. Don't you feel sometimes like a bit of a pipsqueak in these offices up against that...
8-story building with, I don't know how many employees they have. Sure we do. But that doesn't discourage me. We're getting bigger rapidly. And I don't think it's a function of size. I think it's a function of effectiveness. So I don't think that the future is bleak for handgun control, and I do think the NRA is going to have a real battle on their hands in this next Congress.
The wall charts in the Shields office tell which congressmen favor gun control and which are against, and who may be undecided. It's those undecideds whom Shields would like to push over into the pro-gun control column. And finally, Shields has one full-time lobbyist, a young man who has worked in Congress before and knows the ropes. Shields himself came over from a well-paying management job at DuPont as an unpaid volunteer. He's now on salary, $10,000 a year. Shields' outfit depends mostly on well-placed volunteers in business and the law. But Shields does most of the traveling and most of the talking. He talks to anyone and everyone. These are students at Mercersburg Academy in Pennsylvania. It's his son Nick's old prep school.
Did you know that during the Vietnam War, more Americans were murdered with handguns here at home in, quote, peaceful America than died in Vietnam? That's a fact, and that's handguns. not hunting rifles and shotguns. And that's murder, not accidents or suicides.
So what does Pete Shields want? He says that as a beginning, a federal law that would make everyone who owns a handgun register and license that gun. Owning a gun would be like owning a car.
I'm not talking about taking the handguns away from police, military, security guards, etc. They just do more harm than good, and we got to find a solution. It ain't gonna be easy. We've been debating this since 1934. If it was easy, we would have had the solution. But can you visualize if we have 40 million handguns extant in the civilian hands in society now? 40 million, that's a big number. What's it going to be like in 23 years when we have 100 million? Is that the type of society you want to live in?
Still an inconvenience to the common man if he's got to go out and buy a $100 rifle or he's got to wait to call the police.
I will ask you, how much inconvenience is worth a life?
What are you going to do about the guns that are already on the streets illegally?
That is why I am personally for the total ban and would like to somehow buy those back. Because you got 40 million. The first step, I'm trying to prevent it from growing from 40 million to 100 million.
You've been telling us about the problem. What can we do to help?
Number one, you can talk to your father and your mother and say, hey, Dad, do you own a handgun? Why? What are you going to do with it?
And Pete Shields has gone right into the lion's den. Here in San Antonio, hard by the Alamo, the cradle of Texas liberty, at the annual convention of big game hunters for whom guns are a way of life, Pete Shields debates with the very symbol of NRA resistance to handgun control. The NRA's Vice President, Harlan Carter.
The gun control debate does a great disservice to the cause of law enforcement. We ought to be debating, my friends, what to do with criminals instead of what to do with the property of people who commit no crimes. The very essence of all of this is that you deprive a man of a liberty because he might abuse it. And I respectfully submit to you that if we can ever embark upon the principle that because a liberty might be abused, the government can restrict it, restrain it, or abolish it, ladies and gentlemen, you have lost everything.
Again, you're talking, Harlan, about being able to carry a handgun around in your belt. And you're saying that is a liberty that I demand at the expense of 25,000 lives per year, 1 million violent crimes per year, of which 300,000 have handguns. How do you equate your convenience or your macho to be able to carry a handgun in your belt against the 25,000 lives that are
It isn't
lost?
that at all. The price of those lives I put up against my right to the presumption of innocence, my right against self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment, the right of due process under the Fifth Amendment, that the government can't seize my property without due process, and the right I have in law enforcement that my house be secure against no-knock searches and intrusions by policemen who are seeking a gun that I have there. Those things are worth all the lives you will ever pay for.
Mr. Shields, isn't the gun so much part of America, so much part of our history, our lives, everything else, that you'll never get rid of it through lobbying?
There's no question that this country has a gun culture. We have more guns than any other country in the world, and of course we have the homicide rate to prove it. But I think you're wrong. The polls all show that 77% of the people, in fact, since 1934 when polls were first taken, that over 70% of the public wants to see gun control. We have to coalesce them into an effective force in the grassroots of this country to put the pressure on the politicians to vote for effective handgun control.
Well, the NRA would make you believe, and I must say they make a convincing case, that they already have the grassroots of America.
Well, yes, sure, they say that, but look at their membership. They talk about they represent all hunters in this country. They have 1 million to 1.5 million members, they claim. There are 20 million hunters in this country, and they certainly don't represent all of those. I don't think the NRA represents more than a very small minority of people that are involved emotionally with guns, whether they be collectors or whether they be target shooters. And the point is that those people are so emotionally involved with guns that they have become what we call one-issue voters. So in your congressional district, if you're a congressman, you may have 2%, 3%, I don't know what size minority, who are so emotionally involved with guns that they say to you, well, I'm going to judge you at the next election on this one issue only. Now, the problem is, what congressman can afford to give away, for sure, a 2%, 3% slice of the vote where they're not sure of picking it up on the other side? So what we have to do is we have to emotionalize and create fervor within the pro-control public to make it palatable for the congressman to vote for control.
Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that crime is a social problem. It is an economic problem, an education problem. You cannot improve socio-economic conditions by the passage of a gun law.
Neil Knox, the editor of Rifle magazine, poses the toughest question yet for Pete Shields.
I submit to you that in not one case can the advocates of, quote, gun control, whatever that is, in any of its forms, not one case can they cite where it has reduced crime.
We have 20,000 state and local laws in this country, and of course our opposition says, see, they don't work, no gun control will work. Well, it's not true. First thing we have to do is get the commerce in guns and base federal law to allow some of these states to implement their own laws with some chances of having them succeed. Then if Massachusetts, New Jersey wants real tough handgun control and Texas and Louisiana don't, all right, then they can begin to get what the people in that state want.
Except that in the end you'd have what precisely you have now. For example, in New York City you have the Sullivan Law, the toughest gun control, handgun control law in the country. And all you have to do is go down to South Carolina and buy not as many guns as you want, but enough guns to go and kill someone.
That's the problem now, and that's why we need base federal law. We have to get some uniformity.
Are you going to do what the NRA does and target certain congressmen, make up your own hit list?
Certainly. Come the 1978 election, we will be getting activists within the swing congressional districts of this country, and we will choose some hit list of our own to try and defeat either in primaries or in the actual election.
Do you see the NRA as simply some kind of evil genius behind a movement to prevent gun control?
I see the leadership of the NRA in that light. I think the average NRA member is a rational person. He's a sportsman, a lover of hunting. In fact, my son used to get the American Rifleman and was a member of the NRA and took some of their safety courses when he was young. And I think that's what they ought to stick to. They're good at it. They know guns, rifles and shotguns, and they're good at that. Now, I think the average NRA member doesn't know and has been led by the leadership of the NRA. I don't think I had any attitudes on this issue before Nick was murdered. Sure, I had read about gun control in the papers, and I'd read about the crime wave and sat around cocktail parties chatting about it, but I had never gotten emotionally involved, and that's what I think it takes. That's how we're going to have to mobilize the public on our side against the emotional gun owners that the NRA says it speaks for.
The American landscape is dotted with the families of victims. At the temple Oheb Shalom in Baltimore, Mrs. Lois Hess mourns the loss of her son Stuart. He was murdered by a thief with a handgun. He was 24, almost the same age as Pete Shields' son. Lois Hess has gone to work for Pete Shields as a volunteer in the crusade to control handguns.
These young men died violent deaths in violent America. But death need not be just an ending. To me, it can be and has been a beginning. I didn't bury my feelings with the dead. Instead, I went public with our loss, to make it America's loss, in the hope that through this I might reduce the probability of some other young men suffering his same fate. We have to get the victims of this country to come out and say, look, not just be passively for gun control, but say it's time to stop fighting violence with just counter-violence. We have to get them emotionalized